So our first track, moving right into things because we're a little bit late, is about delivering a digital customer experience that consumers will trust. Here we go. And just I'll briefly introduce our two panelists. We have Chuck Schofield, who is the VP of Sales and Dealer Development at AutoGravity. He and his team handle nationwide dealer-facing engagement, recruiting, and customer service. And with various previous roles, he had 27 years at Daimler Financial Services. He was responsible for managing U.S. finance products and service and sales. And we also have Rinaldi Halim. He is serving as the dealer principal of Los Angeles Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram. That's quite a mouthful. And managing partner of the Downey Nissan and Nissan of Tustin. And welcome, gentlemen, and take it away.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dorsey. And welcome to everybody. Appreciate your interest in the track. And I hope we can do it justice. I'm feeling good about it. Again, my name's Chuck Schofield. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Dealer Development for AutoGravity. And for those of you who aren't familiar with AutoGravity, it's a company that back in 2015 was incubated in partnership with Boston Consulting Group Digital Ventures right down the street here at Manhattan Beach, fully funded at the time by Daimler Financial Services. The charter of the team was to look at the automobile industry and figure out what were some disruptive concepts that you could take to market, operationalize on, scale, and be successful. What ultimately came out of that was this notion of AutoGravity, which is simply put, a digital platform where consumers, dealers, and lenders can transact. We currently have 27 lenders on our platform, and when consumers search dealer inventory, find a car, they can apply for financing and receive up to as many as 4 offers. In the fall of 2017, Volkswagen Credit acquired a 20% interest in the company. So we've got important investors. They expect a lot. We're learning a lot. So our technology continues to evolve. What we're looking to do is really to find means that aren't so specific as to buy a car now, but to have a deeper understanding of what that customer journey is and how we can accommodate what it is a customer needs at the point in time in that journey and provide it to them so we can stay relevant. We've just recently gotten into the pure lead space as well. So we want to continue to increase our presence and our footprint, but it's a long journey to figuring out how consumers ultimately are going to behave at every step of the customer journey and be able to engender trust along the way, and that's what we're going to talk about here, and then translate that trust to a dealership. It sounds simple, doesn't it?
Super easy.
Right. Nothing to it. So as you can imagine, we've done tons of research, but I think this is a pretty good place to start because these are takeaways that I think aren't surprising and we're all familiar with it. But we asked over 1,500 consumers across a whole spectrum of personas about the buying experience and what were the biggest stress points. And not surprisingly, negotiating was one of them. Visiting a dealership was another one. And then understanding the economics, finding out budget. So if you think about all the tools that are available right now and all the information that's available, anybody not familiar with the car industry would say, well, how can that be? So Rinaldi, it would be good to start out with all of these tools, why isn't there any trust with consumers and maybe with dealers and consumers and the information they have?
Well, I think it's 100% the customer's fault.
All right, we'll take questions now.
No, I'm joking. I think the question is also, what does it take? Why does it take so long to buy a car, right? And my answer to that is, it's this perverse universe where both parties are supposed to engage in this large transaction, don't trust each other. So the ecosystem's set up for failure from the beginning. One of the first things they teach us when we first enter automotive retail is buyers are liars. So, and I don't have to sit here and go through the fact that most consumers don't trust anything the dealer has to say or present. So when those two parties get together and they're trying to weed through each other's real agenda, that's what makes the whole process really inefficient, and that's what kills time.
So even though there's information out there, there's just some psychology, but by the time they walk into the store, they're sort of steeling themselves for deception or something unpleasant. Can you talk a little bit about, from a dealer's perspective, the information that's out there? Negotiating tools, blogs about what to do when you come into a store, or payment calculators that make this challenge for you even more so.
Well, I think that there's just too much information out there, and there's just too many variables, right? It's not just about price. When you look at leasing, there's certain OEMs, certain captive lenders, they have up to 9 tiers of money factors, which can really throw off somebody's payment expectations. You've got trade evaluators that are out there. Well, there's KBB, there's Edmunds, there's NADA, there's Black Book. The consumer doesn't know what to believe. Like, which number do I go with? Which one is a real one? And when they see an ad that says 0% for 72 months, they automatically think that everybody qualifies and it's available in all models. And so it's just an array of things, and there's just too many variables, and the customer at the end of the day gets confused. They don't know what's real. So when they ask a dealer for that information, they just assume whatever we tell them. It's not real, it's not accurate. So that's what holds it up.
Yeah, and I would add parenthetically as well that it's impossible for a dealer to know, because customers aren't always, there's not full disclosure there. What was the source of that information? How did they come to this realization? And how do you sort of unwind that when you're trying to establish a rapport, right?
Correct.
So not knowing what they looked at or how they even interpreted it is a bit of a problem.
Correct.
So there's nothing in the middle there that's sort of the referee, if you will, that both entities are sort of using as the arbiter of truth.
Yeah, there's no demilitarized zone there. There's no DMZ. So it's, there needs to be a platform that what I call is a fact checker, right? That lets the consumer know that the information they are receiving is accurate, it's factual, and it's to be believed. And unfortunately, there's nothing like that out there. Not that the tech companies that exist today are doing a bad job. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is a lot of the tech companies are giving the dealer the tools, and we use them as widgets that we slap on our website. The moment we do that, the tool loses all credibility, because the consumer assumes that if it's attached to the dealer, it's a tool that exists in the dealer's world to help the dealer, not the consumer.
So just to put another finer point on that, where technology is employed by dealerships, you and I have talked about this, and I've seen it in my career, where technology is brought in and the supposition is, well, this is going to fix things. Just because I have this, I'm going to see an increase in sales. So, technology is a tool, absent a really understandable strategy to wrap around it. That's where I see a lot of this technology fail, because it's not viewed in that light. Would you agree with that?
I agree. It's all about how you use it.
There was an interesting point made by Eric Gale today that I think fits in here as well. And I wrote it down, and you talked about dealerships having to, especially long established stores in major markets, you have so much data. And that data, if it's understood correctly, is telling you stories about what to do next, or what to do and what not to do. And yet, when you look at how dealerships need to evolve going forward, you got to ask yourself, what sort of disciplines are going to be more helpful as we go forward? Not just traditional salespeople, but as you have technology, you don't need an IT person. I'm in the technology world now, so I'm going to go ahead and say it, but a data scientist. And when I think about put a data scientist in a dealership, that almost sounds sort of counterintuitive, but you have so much of it, that's probably a more valuable asset going forward than just somebody in IT. Right?
Correct.
All right, so we know that there's this gap in trust. And yet there's some successful salespeople, and there's fundamental things that they do to gain trust. Talk about what those are, if you would.
Well, most dealerships have one or two, maybe even a small group of established salespeople who's been at the store for a long time, who can facilitate, more transactions than the average salesperson. Well, why is that? Because that salesperson has to spend less time explaining all those variables using, let's say, 10 sentences instead of 100 sentences, because he or she has a lot of credibility. The average salesperson that works at a dealership that hasn't been there for very long, that just got hired off the street or what have you, that person has to spend a lot more time explaining all those variables I talked about earlier. So that inefficiency, that time killer is an expense driver.
All right.
So
we talk about trust not just as this nice sort of thing to have, because it's a happier experience, but when you tie it operationally to how it impacts a dealership, there's a bottom line consequence to it.
correct.
And when there's more of it, there's greater efficiencies, there's more throughput, and that has operational benefit, right?
Correct.
So there are resources out there right now that aren't necessarily digital, that engender trust already, that you employ every now and again, right? One would be a personal referral,
Right?
and another would be brokers that exist.
Correct.
Can you talk a little bit about both of those and how that impacts the dealership when they're available to you?
Correct. So there are plenty of stores across the U.S. that employ a designated salesperson to deal with a group of brokers, right? So you ask yourself, as an operator, how can one person deliver 50, 60 units in 1 month? And it's difficult for the traditional salesperson to deliver 12 to 14 units. Well, once again, it goes back to that person designated dealing with brokers does not have to spend a ton of time explaining the intricate details of a transaction, why the payment is the way it is, why the trade-in is valued at the way it is. Somebody else is doing that work for that person. That allows that person to deliver 50, 60 units. The average salesperson on the retail floor that has to take ups, right? They spend a lot of time talking about things that are inevitable. So the model already exists. It's already out there. It's being done now. I know of, just having the franchise that I own, talking to counterparts, I know of certain parts of the country where 40 to 50% of the new car reported sales are broker referred sales. So it's already out there. It's just not technologically driven.
So again, we come back to this notion of trust. There's an entity out there that is acquiring it, and it's outside of the store.
Correct.
Right? So
the perception is independent third-party arbitrator doing all the work, taking all the inefficiencies out of the transaction.
right. So that's where technology can play a greater role. And I'm not talking about something as specific as digital retailing, press this button. So if we go back a bit to how we would reimagine a technology to help deliver on what you're experiencing with personal references and brokers, we're coming to understand through our engagements with our dealerships, and your input has been invaluable, and just conversations we're starting to hold with customers. Most technology starts with pick a VIN, buy a car.
Correct.
Right? And what that sort of ignores is all the things that led up to that point. That's not where consumers start. But there's value to understanding how they got to that point. And to the extent those things can be captured and understood, as a technology, you become a more useful and considerate platform. And this industry has been built on 30-day increments. So that's why this immediacy is always so important. And that's why I think technology has been geared towards pick a VIN, buy a car. But we increasingly think there's an opportunity to go back to how did they get there, and don't serve it up to a dealer until it gets to a point where all the things that you just talked about, what are they looking for, why are they looking for it, do they qualify, are they ready to go, And that's basically what personal referrals and brokers are doing right now, and being able to deliver that in a very understandable way.
Correct.
Right? Because we know and have always believed that dealers are essential. Right? We're not trying to disintermediate anybody. We're trying to do something digitally that can be done digitally that's going to affect the bottom line. Work on the things at a dealership that really create fiscal results, and not busy work and sort of this feeling out period, which is the first 2 hours of a car deal. Correct?
Correct.
So, when we have talked about these sort of things, the moment of truth of actually buying a car wasn't necessarily the goal, right? So in visiting with Rinaldi and some of the research we did and looking at some conversations, which they're tough to break down in terms of pure data point, but there's themes that come out of this. And what we've found is that dealers, really what they're looking for is we call it a trusted referral. A lead is a dispassionate sort of throwaway thing.
Correct.
Out of 100 calls you make at the store, how many turn into deals?
Well, the answer is how many out of 100 leads, internet leads that we do receive, how many turn into deals? National average is 10%, 15%. It all varies, and they're not great stats. What happens to the other 85? Should they have been served up to us? Should we have paid for them? Right?
Yes.
Were those customers even ready to buy a car? Were they even really in market? Are they even in a position to buy a car? Right? I mean, have they had their trade long enough, or do they just happen to be surfing the web and saw an ad on a new model that seemed kind of cool, but realistically, financially, they shouldn't be looking at that car because they're only 9 months in on their current one. So when those leads come in and we end up responding to them and working them, what does that do to our expense structure?
Right.
So,
and you've always said that time is money. So it's the expense of having it, and 90% of the time, maybe 85% of the time, it's wasted effort.
correct.
There's got to be a better answer, right?
Correct.
So you started to talk about these moments of truth that need to be understood to understand if they're really at a point in time where you can help them.
Correct.
And helping them could mean that they're actually going to buy a car, or it could mean you're just helping them throughout the process. And if you do that, you're going to be relevant. Would you say that's a meaningful, trusted referral and something that would be of interest to a store if it's just that bit, if we could introduce it to you?
Yeah, absolutely, because it exists today.
Perfect. So this is where we've sort of, and the work is ongoing. There's no silver bullet here. We love to learn at AutoGravity. And so what we've been able to do with these conversations we've looked at and with speaking with our dealers is sort of break down the nature of where sort of most people are. People come to us and ask questions about cars. What does this car do? Does this car have this? I'm sure dealerships, you hear it all the time. If they want to know it, there's somewhere further down the scale of intent. That'd be good to know. Secondly, a test drive. They've done whatever research until the point where they're serious enough to say, I need to get into this car to figure out the next step. So those are product related. On the sort of the more transactional side, we see the following questions about finance. What are the programs, or can you get me financed? That's not uncommon. Car availability, that may sound like product, but what they're talking about here is I've decided on that car. Is that car there? So that sounds like they're ready to move on that car. Then the last piece is, if I do all these things, and there was a wonderful example given this morning where the young lady from Canvas talked about her car experience. She called the store and said, is this car here? I've got my money. I'm ready to go. People want assurance of that. So we look at this in the spectrum of this as being able to offer any one of those categories as a trusted referral, and dealerships, we're understanding, see value in those lanes. Did I miss anything of these 5, or are those too general, do you think, Rinaldi?
No, and I think that when digital retailing platforms come to market, right, the whole idea is to save time and make a speedy transaction. But how do you define a transaction? Is it all the way from car questions all the way to taking delivery of the car? Or is it from the time that you decided, you know what, I'm ready to go. I know what I can afford. I know what I want. How fast can you knock it out? Right? What's an actual transaction?
That's where this becomes difficult, right? Because there's, these things can be sort of abstract concepts, and that's why you need to get into, the details of specific transactions, and not just what the consumer's saying, but what's happening at the dealership. Another thing that was said this morning that caught my attention relevant to this is our technology. It needs to be clear to you that what we're doing is leveraging what you already have. You don't need to get more stuff to be a partner with us. You have cars, you have real estate, you have people. How do we find all this information out and then deliver it to you in a way that you can fulfill?
I need you to convince my customers that I'm giving them a good deal.
Right.
So they just buy the car.
Right.
So.
Okay. I want to talk next a little bit about what dealerships. So understanding all of this, right? If we had a technology that could sort of be this best, I guess the traditional line for it is liner in the car industry. Dealers still have to be able to deliver on the other end. So customers, even though they get information, there's still an opportunity to get them comfortable with, how do I get certainty that I'm going to see a certain person, they're going to know exactly what it is I want, no more and no less, and they're going to be there when I get there, and these things are going to happen as I had hoped. Do you see a change in how you train salespeople, how you modify processes to accommodate that sort of solution?
Well, as I talked about,
who you hire?
Yeah, as I talked about before, the model already exists. A lot of stores already have 1 or 2 people designated to deal with these types of transactions, right? So you already know how to do it. It's already being done. So, and if you really look at your whole operation, you think to yourself, you know what? When it comes to time, that is the most efficient part of my operation. Now, obviously, having to pay broker fees and referral fees and all those things, like that's a separate issue. That's the reason why we're doing this, right? To try to figure out how to minimize those things. But I don't think it's as hard. Solving it from a tech standpoint would be more difficult than facilitating it after that part's done, because we're already doing it, is what I'm saying. So, and I also think that'll, especially in California, there's, the labor laws are a little tricky out here, right? So, part of why overtime with inside salespeople is such a problem is because you don't have too much control over how quick you can educate a customer about how factual the numbers are, the money factor, the residual, the rate versus the rebate. These things take time. So if all that stuff's done away from the dealership on a tech platform, it makes your opening, your closing hours, time management, systems, processes much easier to deal with.
So again, it comes back to technology not just being cool and something that speaks into it. It consequentially affects the bottom line. And in a market like LA, the labor laws are what they are. There's even more incremental value in it. So if you think about how you were trained when you got into the car business, and the type of people that you need to increasingly staff your stores with, talk about the main differences.
Product specialists and delivery specialists. That would be the biggest difference. When we're sitting here talking about negotiations and all these things, it's really hard for me to understand what is it that we're really negotiating, because there's no more margin in new cars. So you take that out of the equation. The OEM, obviously on tier 2 and tier 1 levels, now have gotten used to advertising special APR and special lease rates. So you took that out of the equation. You've got all these trade evaluation platforms that volunteer information to the consumer, what their trade is potentially worth. So really, there's not much left to negotiate except for compiling all this data, all these numbers into a calculator and spit out the results. And it's the industry's job to explain to the consumer, it's just simple mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4. Doesn't matter where you're at.
So we've talked about two things. So there's a different type of person that's going to be on the floor, not just that pure sort of hard closing salesperson, product specialist, and delivery specialist. That's going to be an increasing need. And you began to touch on the data piece and how you use that in stores, and we talked about that a little earlier. Now, I'm going to come back to that because again, I was sincere when I talked about dealers needing to increasingly think about a skill set within the store that can look at data that can tell them stories that you can then operationalize on. And I know that from our early experience, it was interesting as you integrate with CRM systems and that sort of thing, that it becomes this very sort of functional engagement and people forget about what we're trying to do in the end. And I'll give you an example where our consumers were concerned they were getting finance offerings. They were being fed into the CRM systems, and then what was being created is whatever functionality in the CRM system was reaching out and touching these people and saying things that were disconnected from what just happened to us. Like, hey, have you considered financing? And people are going, well, I thought I just got financing here. That seems like a miss that shouldn't happen. Correct. But how much data cleanup do you see with CRM systems, with data mining software and those sort of things? What sort of things do we need to be aware about so we're not creating even an additional mess?
Well, I think API integration into the dealership's DMS would be an important thing, because the biggest problem right now, like forget data for a second, when you look at digital retailing solutions or loan calculators that are just widgets on dealerships' websites, I saw an article on CVT News a few weeks ago, how although these things are put in place with good intention and there's a lot of cool pieces of tech behind it, the conflicting information between sales tax, how it's calculated, because different counties have different sales tax, different credit tiers, the payment being spit out, the data being spit out is not accurate when you compare it to reality. Once the credit is pulled, once the VIN's finalized, once the information is actually entered into the DMS, because the DMS auto-calculates, let's say, 45 days till the first payment. So I think integration is real important.
To that point, do you think some of the technology's gotten too ambitious? Like we're going to get to an actual specific payment, recognizing all the nuance and moving parts?
I think
more hurtful than helpful.
Yeah, I think that I don't think that anybody truly understands what the consumer really wants, and I don't think the consumer knows what they really want. I hear this from people all the time. I don't want to haggle. I don't want to hassle. I want to get in. I want to get out. The issue that I'm seeing too is like when you do make it that way, a lot of consumers feel like, wait, that was too easy. Did I just get ripped off? Did I leave money on the table? So there's a lot of conflicting information out there, and the only thing that could tell us the truth would be, over time, a collection of data of what reality is.
Stores really committing to this bottom piece here, and I almost hate to say it this way because I've been in this business 30 years, and I've learned never tell a dealer how to do business. But the point we're trying to make is there's this fulfillment process that has to be honored, right? And there's nothing beyond common sense that would be disagreeable. And we've had even in our current on our current platform instances where this has happened. Somebody's applied for a loan on a car. They got 4 offers. The dealer saw it. We made an appointment. They went in, and it was pleasant. And sat there and said, "Wow, we just need to do that 10,000 more times a month, and we'll be in good shape." But the point is that it sounds like common sense. There's a lot of nuance, and it's very fluid, but it can happen. And from a dealer perspective, with product specialists and delivery specialists, you see this as a space that's inevitable, correct?
Correct. It's already happening now.
Got it. I think we've covered about as much as we can. We got about 5 or 15 minutes left, but I'm willing to open it up to questions. Rinaldi, thank you. Appreciate it.
What role do the OEMs
We've got a microphone, just so everybody can hear the question.
Hi, I'm Jeff Strelick with Honda. What role do you see the OEMs playing in this building of trust?
First, I got to check to see if any of my OEMs are. I don't want to say anything crazy. No.
Okay, we'll talk for beer later.
No, earlier I talked about mistrust, right? The consumer doesn't trust the dealer doesn't trust the consumer. Well, you know who else doesn't trust us? The OEM. The OEM doesn't think, depending on who you are, the general belief is you could sell more cars, you should be nicer to the customers, and all these things. In fact, an OEM survey will look like this. Did you receive any pressure while you were trying to buy a car? In the meantime, you got tasked with a stair-step number. So I think the OEM can help a little bit when it comes down to that. I would also argue that certain national ads, right, need to be reviewed with the dealer council, with the dealer body, to make sure that it's a lineup that we have, decent, ample supply of, because that's another thing that throws the customers' heads into a tailspin. Is they saw an ad for $299 a month. It'll be a C-class Mercedes, but down payment's $59.95, 10,000 miles a year. It's on a base model. They didn't make a whole lot of them, right? So, and then the reality is they don't want that one. They want one with a little bit more goodies, and the number doesn't jive in their mind. Well, the OEM says so. You're a dealer, you're a liar. So now the transaction gets prolonged, right? When it didn't have to be that way. So better communication between the dealer and the OEM, definitely.
Yeah. I'll admit up front, I think I'm decidedly alone in this thinking, and it may even be misguided, but the word courage was thrown around this morning, and I think it would be interesting if the industry in general kind of took a step back and asked the question, why do things happen the way they do? I think a lot of the problems or challenges, the consumer challenges, the economic challenges, are created because we, the stakeholders, have made it so. In other words, the market didn't ask us to do business this way. It's not even good economics. But when you go out to the market and say, you got 30 days to sell this much, and if you do, I give you this, and if you don't, you don't get X. And we want great experiences, and we want people to understand everything, and now there's this sense of urgency, and there's this fear, and this, it creates, it's of its own making. So, what's magical about 30 days? I mean, are people just not going to buy cars if there's not a month end, ever? I get that we've created this behavior to drive to the month end, and it's created this other interesting dynamic I've always seen in my career where when nothing's happening at a dealership, there's way too many people there. When everything's happening at a dealership, there's not nearly enough people there. So, we've conditioned that. Why aren't we taking a step back and looking at these things in a practical way and asking the question, why is that? And I think the answer is because if you don't do it, somebody's still going to do it, and I'm going to fall behind. And I can't stomach that right now. I don't know how to answer that specifically, but I think that's sort of really what's underpinning all of that, and somebody maybe more courageous than I needs to consider that. And GM went to quarterly reporting. I mean, I thought that was an interesting first step.
Yeah, I think also more than ever too, I'm seeing, there's this stigma out there. Dealers just aren't progressive. They're not moving fast enough. But I beg to differ. Most of my counterparts that I talk to, we're all interested in taking the pain and suffering out of all this, out of the mistrust between OEM and dealer to the consumer. Like, we want to be as transparent as ever, but I think that at the same time, though, we all need to behave and go to market accordingly, and our goals and strategies need to be more aligned so that we can deliver the accurate experience to the consumer. So.
Ricky Goyle from Audi of America. One of the things I wanted to ask you was you talked about a payment estimator. So from an OEM perspective, we offer these tools to try to educate a consumer and push them down to either the dealership or tier 3 level to finalize their sale or purchase. But to your point, when that payment estimator on the OEM website doesn't match up with the payments that a dealership is offering, it creates the complete adverse effect. From your perspective, what tools could an OEM implement on a tier 1 site that, one, brings you that customer and facilitates that customer to get down to your level, but also does not create a ecosystem where you may actually piss them off and have differences in information?
Well, that's why I've been working with AutoGravity, right? So AutoGravity, at the core of their foundation, is a direct integration with the OEM's lenders. So the OEM's lenders are, what have you, BMW Financial Services, Volkswagen, Nissan, what have you, have the direct ability to pull data such as lease cash, rebates, special APR. Even special APR can vary, right, from tier to tier to tier. I think a soft pull ability would be awesome, working with AutoGravity, because they have that ability to do so. That way the payment's a little bit more accurate, and obviously most OEMs already have the zip code tab, right? So calculating sales tax into that equation would also help out a lot. Now, a lot of people will argue, hey, we want to show the lowest payment possible, get them in. Well, that's a short-term solution, and it just prolongs this forever going battle between dealer and consumer.
Yeah, the challenge is how do you provide enough of what the consumer's looking for in digestible amounts? I think a lot of websites in general, tools in general, just tend to move towards here's everything you need to know. And from a user experience, I think that oftentimes is why people bounce. And that's why, again, if I had the solution, this would be a different meeting. But I think what we're increasingly learning is that to the extent you can sort of diagnose what you can infer from what they're asking, answer their question and just give them a little bit something more to keep the conversation going. And then over time, something will reveal itself that might be the time to say, okay, here's what you're specifically looking for, and we can accommodate it, and here's some details. The problem with that on the automobile side is it doesn't look like they're buying a car today. So, I want to do everything that's going to move them towards this moment of truth when maybe they're not ready to buy yet. So here's how it works today. Somebody's thinking about buying a car, and they go to a website. Well, in order to get information about a car from a website, you got to give something like your name and your email address and your phone number. And you do that, and then you get a price, let's say. You're not ready to buy. You're just looking at prices. That creates a lead or 2 or 3. Now you've got 2 or 3 dealerships calling you. Now you move to the next step. It's another car. And then maybe you're looking at financing. And by the time you're done, you're one person with 8 leads and 36 pieces of information coming at you. How is that good for any of us? Again, cutting through the clutter is still going to be the biggest challenge. And I think the platform that can keep people on it and interested and giving them what they need when they need it is going to win more often than not.
Ethan Forchette from Deloitte. I've got a million questions, but I'll narrow it down to just this one, which I don't think has been touched on very much. So how do you reconcile with the proliferation of broker business, a lot more online shopping, people trying to zero in on a particular model that they want, then they approach the dealership and that model isn't available at the store, and you have inventory that you have to sell. to engender that trust between a build to stock versus build to order sort of market, which the US, it's a difficult line to walk. How are you driving that home on the sales floor or through AutoGravity, where somebody wants a vehicle you just don't have, you're trying to get them into something that you can sell, either whether to hit the stair step or not? Like, how is that? How are you managing that on your sales floor?
At 17 million, sorry, inventory hasn't been a problem. We had a ton of inventory, variety of inventory hasn't been a problem. But if we were to be faced with that, I guess, challenge, I don't know. Haven't really ran into it too much within the last few years, but I wouldn't mind doing special order.
So to clarify, with the brands that you carry, you don't run into that where, hey, I wanted a red car with beige interior, you don't have it.
Yeah,
But I've got a black one with black interior, would you like that?
yeah, it's possible. We're brand agnostic, so any dealership can join our platform. But were we to run into that, I mean, we do our best to offer up what we have. I'm a pretty magnanimous guy. We're trying to help them. If we don't have it, we don't have it. But I think the lesson to that is, how do we make sure that that situation doesn't happen again? Maybe we're not in the right market. Maybe we don't have the right brands. So we'd have to learn something from it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.